First thing I have to do is apologize for so rudely turning my back to you. I hate this. The FRA requires that I look this direction all the way down to Gold Hill. I think just so I can identify what we hit. Now this railroad was first built back in 1869. That means we're 152 years old. However, this is not the original crew. Half those people are dead. The Bank of California built the railroad because they had repossessed many of the mines up here and actually several other businesses. And they wanted a very inexpensive way to get there or down to the Carson River Canyon, where of course they also owned the only hydraulic stamp or reduction. They pretty much had a financial stranglehold on just about everything going on up here. As you might imagine, because of that, they were not very well liked at all. If you're looking at me right now, I am pointing out to my left. That side is east. Way over there to the east, you see that great big pile of dirt? That is the combination mine. In 1883, that was the deepest mine shaft in the entire world. 3,265 feet deep. Wow. Now, you're not going to believe this next part, but it is absolutely true. Every day, they had to pump 2 million gallons of water out of that mine just so they could try and go deeper. The mine over there also had the distinction of having the very first telephone system in the entire state of Nevada. Or of course, at that time, the territory of Utah. That's where they finally invented steel safety cages, made it so much easier getting the miners up and down out of that old deep mine. The steel building right off to the east is the Comstock gold mill, one of the very last ones built, right at the tail end of the last big boom cycle. There's the wooden trestle I promised you. The trestle was there because there were mines on either side of it, and the miners would push their little hand cars right to that point, and then they would dump them down into the open ore cars of the V&T. There were a couple of young superintendents working right there, John Mackey and James Fair. They got a couple other good old Irish buddies, William O'Brien and James Flood, and they all went uptown and very secretly began to purchase little old abandoned mines around the consolidated Virginia mine, which too had been abandoned. Within 30 days of completing those purchases, they discovered what would later become known as the Big Bonanza. They found a ledge of silver ore so big, so pure, it set a world record. It's never been beaten. It still holds the world record. Because of that discovery, the price of silver shot up from $1 an ounce to almost $1,200 an ounce. Overnight, John Mackey became one of the wealthiest men in the world. Now, he and his partners hated the Bank of California. They hated him so much they started their own bank. They called it Bank of Nevada. They wanted to compete head-to-head. Well, not only did they compete, they completely closed down the Bank of California. I get a little check once a month as long as I continue to stress that part of the history. No, I don't. I should, but I don't. Right over here off to the east, you see a whole bunch of our railroad cars. We got some diesel locomotives, a couple of Pullman coach cars. Way back in the middle of the shop there is the number 29 steam locomotive. Right here on the east side of the tracks, almost underneath the tracks, there's a little hole in the ground. Well, it's actually 1,800 feet deep. And that is the Julia mine, and it's named in honor of the internationally famous Miss Julia Boulay. She, of course, was one of the very first courtesans or ladies of the evening up here, and sadly, she met with a very untimely fate. The morning of her funeral, 4 beautiful white stallions pulled the hearses and headed out the cemetery north of town. Right behind the hearse, a bunch of the city fathers got in line because they wanted to pay their last respects. Right behind them, there were actually a whole bunch of international dignitaries, guys from around the world. They too had known Julia, so they joined this somber little parade. Last but not least, there are about 3,000 of, without a doubt, the saddest looking miners you've ever seen in your life. There was a time when 100 miners all got sick up here at the same time because of some bad water. And Julia took every one of them into her home and nursed them all back to health. She was even more beloved after that. Well, believe it or not, we're right in the middle of our first tunnel of the day. This used to be tunnel number 5, and it used to be a real tunnel. It was 97 feet long. But at the time of the construction of the truck route up to Virginia City, the highway department came along and daylighted or dynamited the roof off this tunnel so they could put that little permanent steel crossing in place. The truck route is that little highway you see directly across from us off to the east. That is State Route 341. Every year, we close that highway for 4 days, and we have car races on it. Coming up again in September, the Ferrari Car Club of North America is going to be back. And boy, you talk about a sight. You watch a whole bunch of Ferraris just screaming up and down that little mountain highway. It's pretty incredible. Right here on both sides of the tracks, we have a glorious display of our breathtaking state flower, the Artemisia tridentata. Don't try and find it down there. That's just a fancy name for sagebrush. We do have our mountain juniper and our pinyon pine trees here, though. The pinyon pine offered up a staple for both the Washoe and Paiute Indian diets in the form of pine nuts. Hey, what do we still make from pine nuts? Pesto. Very good. Why do we bother to harvest juniper berries? What do we get? This guy did the homework. Gin, yeah, that's where we get gin. He just saved you from having to take the oral exams. Yeah, I'm kidding. All right, this is what life is like as a miner. Boy, it was terrible. Every one of these mines had hot air temperatures of 140. Also, they all were full of very hot subsurface water, and the water temperature was 190. Now think about that for a minute. When you combine those two elements, you can just imagine how brutal life was. The miners could only work for 15 minutes at a time, and then they would slump down somewhere and try and catch their breath. And then they'd go right back to work. And they did that for over 8 hours, sometimes 6 days a week, because at the end of every shift, they would go up to B Street, where the paymaster's offices were located, and they would be given $4. Believe it or not, that made them the highest paid miners in the world. Other miners were working around the globe for as little as 25 cents a day. Up here, 75 cents would get you a complete steak dinner and dessert. And if you really, really wanted a fresh hot bath once a week, that was a dime. The room they were living in was about $3 a month. You could buy an entire gallon of Old Tub whiskey, part of the original Jim Beam brand, for 15 cents. As you can imagine, if you could survive the job and make it safely back up to the street level, there was plenty of money left. You could go up and have a real good time. And they did. Now we're about ready to enter our second tunnel of the day. This is actually our first real tunnel. This is tunnel number 4. This tunnel is 287 feet. Now you know when they were digging this tunnel, they didn't have any explosives to work with. So it was all done by picks and shovels. In spite of that, it was completed in a record amount of time because they were averaging 18 inches a day of new tunnel. Another real good reason for keeping your hands inside the car is Tunnel 4 is the permanent home to the Llama Bobcat and 2 Cubs. Right over here on the west side, right behind you, see a little dirt road going up the hill there? That's part of the original wagon road up to Virginia City. year I had a very nice family out there visiting from New York City. And as soon as I pointed that out, the lady just started shaking her head, and I finally had to ask why. And she said, I don't think the horse would ever go up anything that steep. And I said, well, yeah, they did, and they had to drag a stagecoach or a freight wagon behind them. But she wasn't buying it. Just kept shaking her head. Well, now I know for sure that they don't have anything like that in the middle of Central Park. Also over here on the west, in just a minute, we're going to go past a whole bunch of green trees. Right in behind them is what's left of tunnel number 3. This was the Fort Homestead tunnel. We tried for 2 years to open this up and just couldn't pull it off. It's too unstable. Look at the top of the tunnel and then the bottom of it as we go by, and you're going to see that it just still continues to cave in a little more every year. They called it the Fort Homestead Tunnel because there actually was a Union encampment right up on the top of it. And they had 4 small cannons up there, and they fired those cannons off to announce each and every Union Army victory during the Civil War. Had a whole bunch of people on the very last train for North Carolina. They did not get a kick out of that part of the story. As we begin to work our way down into Gold Hill, the first prominent building you see down there, the one with the big sloping steel roof, that's the Crown Point Mill. It's sitting directly beneath the famous Crown Point mine. When you get home, go on YouTube, look up Crown Point Mill, Gold Hill, Nevada, and they show you the inside of it, kind of how it worked. Pretty interesting stuff. The Gold Hill Hotel and Saloon is one of the finest of the Old West, and the longest in continuous operation in the state of Nevada. They've been there 162 years. The last famous building is that one with all the red brick. That's where the Bank of California used to be. Boy, I wish you could have seen how big the vault was in the back of that little bank. Within 3 months of completing this little railroad, the boys of the bank began to enjoy profits in excess of $485,000 a month. Today's money, that would be $74.35 million. Definitely a prosperous little short line railroad. Look at this bell tower right here beside the highway. That bell used to hang above the Liberty Firehouse. It was just 2 blocks down the street. I have a trick question for you. What do you think happened to the Liberty Firehouse? It did not burn down. I told you it was a trick question. Actually, one day, some high winds just blew it over. The Gold Hill Depot over here was put there strictly for freight use because there's no such thing as a passenger train coming through there. Here's those trees and bushes that I promised you. They get a little closer every week. In about 3 more weeks, I'm going to promise you another thing. There's going to be a whole bunch of deer right there every single day. Once we clear the trees and bushes, right back up over your shoulders where the first gold discoveries were made back in 1859. Well, you know, while those miners were desperately chasing that gold, they kept having to work their way through that really soft blue mud. It was a mess. It got into everything. They just kept shoveling it off to the side, and then they watched it, and as it dried out, it became solid, just like concrete. So they started taking it uptown and began to fill in some of the potholes with it. Then one day, some much more experienced Mexican miners came out this way. They looked at that stuff that was being thrown away, and they said, mucha plata, which loosely translated meant, you idiots are throwing away an awful lot of very valuable silver ore. Late that night, the potholes began to reappear uptown. Now we're going to stop here, and you're going to hear one short whistle blast, and that means it's safe to stand up. And if you want to switch cars, now's the time to do it. Don't get off. It's a long uphill walk back to where you parked. Okay, guys, while we're still here, there are several famous mines very close to where we are. If you were to walk down that little canyon about 200 yards and then whirl around and start working your way back up the canyon, you would pass the following famous mines, all very near. The Rock Island and the Rhode Island mine are down there. The Chicago and the New York mines are down there. The
Caledonia mine is there, right here below us. The huge Trojan mine is located. But you know what? We just passed another famous mine right back here behind us. That one with the big old wooden ore chute. That's the Kane mine. And just like Dr. Seuss said, they didn't use the Y, we don't know why, they just called it the Kane. That's where John Mackey and James Fair got their very first little sliver of ownership. Now here's how you would go about it if you were willing to work very, very hard. First you'd work 8 hours and you get the $4. And then you'd work another 8-hour shift and they would pay you in what they call feet. Every mine had so many feet. And a foot was equal to 1 share of ownership. Well, they worked very hard, and it didn't take a real long time, and they actually became the owners of the Kane. So now they started working even harder. 6 months later, they'd gone down another 250 feet. Hadn't found a thing. Now they were dead broke. Couldn't even borrow money. Then on New Year's morning, 1866, they kind of hacked their way into a pretty good sized little cavern. It was roughly 10 feet by 20 feet. And it was just full of soft, sugary quartz crystals, loaded with gold and silver ore. Man, within the next 2 years, that little tiny mine right there surrendered $1.6 million worth of gold and silver ore. Now in today's money, that would only be $385 million. John Mackey died in 1902, the age of 71. He was worth at that time $82 billion. He could have had Jeff Bezos pilot him to the moon. That's the kind of money that was. Unfortunately, the most famous mine of the whole area is right here below us. That's that thing that looks like it's made out of concrete, but it isn't. And it's got the 2 big flywheels on top of it. That is the Yellow Jacket mine, and unfortunately, its notoriety came about as a terrible tragedy. In April of 1873, a fire broke out 800 feet above where the miners were working. Make a long story short, 38 miners perished in that fire. That's without a doubt the worst mining tragedy in Nevada's illustrious mining history, and we sure hope it always remains that way. Here's something a little bit more fun. Back behind us and out to the west, you see all that fresh, filled dirt, very clean. A bunch of big boulders, and we're sitting here on a very solid, compacted little level area. 30 years ago, none of this was here. So the ravine that you see starting up at the top of the hill would come right down underneath where we are, down into the bottom of Gold Canyon. This is where the Crown Point Trestle was built. It was 500 feet long, sat about 85 feet up above the canyon floor here, and it was made entirely of wood. Well, the passenger trains would come up here and they'd go, "Nope, don't trust it, not gonna go over it." So they'd stop right back there. And you literally had to walk up to Virginia City or hire a team and a buckboard to take you up there. You could have waited for an Uber, but that would have been an eternity. Now the real irony of all of that is that the V&T Railroad was running 50 trains a day, every single day, back and forth over that trestle. And they were very heavily loaded both ways. Finally, George Pullman came out here. He's the guy that designed and built all those beautiful coach cars. And he crawled all over that trestle, and at the end of a real long day, he proclaimed it more than worthy of any of his passenger cars. And the very next morning, connecting trains came in from Denver and St. Louis and San Francisco, and for the first time went all the way up to the center of Virginia City. All right, now we're going to start our return trip in just a minute, and this time, when we go back in front of that wooden ore chute, I want you to pay real close attention to the bottom of it. They've taken the main ore chute and split it into 3 smaller, kind of evenly placed chutes. Now what that did, it allowed for the main body of ore to come flying down the chute, hit that little bottom, and then a little more evenly fall down into the open ore cars. Now they still had to have some guys with the shovels. Those guys, of course, were known as muckers. by designing the ore chute that way. They figured out really early on that they didn't have to muck and shovel so fast. Did I get through that all right? Already begun our annual wildfire festivities. Every couple of days we pick a little valley and just burn it right to the ground. Last summer, it was so smoky a lady had a hard time picking out that cross on the top of the hill. You see it up there? She asked me if that was indeed a religious symbol, and I said, sure. And then she saw that great big white pole almost up to the top of the next hill, and she asked me if that was a religious symbol. I said, no. That's a Verizon tower, and AT&T doesn't think there's anything religious about that at all. We do get great Wi-Fi here. Now we've had a new wrinkle added to your trip. That right there. That is compliments of that little series of earthquakes we got a few weeks ago. It put a little kink in one of our rails right at that point. Now we're going back twice as fast as we came down because this is the steepest portion of our entire track. We're raising up here at about 4%. Everything else south of us is 2% or less. Now normally we would like to use our number 29 steam locomotive for this local line, but we just got her back recently and she was exhausted. She was starring in a Martin Scorsese film that just recently wrapped production in Pawhuska, Oklahoma. No way. You guys are from Pawhuska? Oh, all right. Well, that's okay too. Just kidding. One of my best buddies. Anyway, there's a couple other stars in that movie. Leonardo DiCaprio and Robert De Niro. Obviously we have no Italian fans. The Oklahoma people would have loved that. Well, the name of the movie is Killers of the Flower Moon. And let me tell you about the tragedy. One spring morning we sent 3 beautiful Pullman coach cars and that steam locomotive off to Oklahoma. And they had only been there 4 hours, and Hollywood came along and painted them the ugliest green I've ever seen. Now, don't tell the boss, because he loves that color. It's the original Pullman green. When we get back to the depot and you are getting off the train, right straight across from me is one of those Pullman cars. You'll see what I mean. They took a bunch of decals and started writing Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad. I don't think so. Now, when you watch that movie, I don't care how big the theater is, just jump up, scream as loud as you can, Virginia and Truckee Railroad, and emerald green and victory yellow. That's the only way you'll get through it. Once we got the locomotive back there, we scraped all that Pullman green color off of it. And so now proudly it says the name Robert Gray. And Bob came up here and it was on fire. Now he obviously was a much better storyteller than a mathematician. But realistically, 90% of Virginia City was totally destroyed and 10,000 people were left homeless. That was roughly a third of the people living here. But there was so much wealth up here, and by that I mean there were more millionaires here than any other city in the world. There were 193 of them. Because of all that wealth within 1 year, everything was totally rebuilt, including that gorgeous church. Now they want you to know everybody's welcome inside. They want you to come in and have a look. I can actually give you a little more incentive for doing that. They sell wine in the basement. Right over here east of us, right over the top of that little steel shed, you're going to see a great big set of grandstands, and very large fenced arena. That's where finally we get to once again have our famous camel races. And you know, we realize that not everybody owns a camel. That's all right. You can bring your zebra, or your llama, or you can even bring your ostrich. 3 years ago, we had 2 little emus from Australia up here racing. You know what else we always have over there every single year without fail? Way too many jackasses. Never fail.
arena, you see a little cone-shaped hill. And you'll be able to see that better once we get past this trestle again. That little cone sits right down in the saddle between two other hills, and they call that Sugarloaf. And that begins what is usually a 100-mile unobstructed view off to the east. Now, it's a little smoky today. It was a heck of a lot worse on Friday. But I love looking at those mountains because I'm a native Nevadan, and I better like it. I live in a state with more mountain ranges than any other state in the union. We have 136 of them. Now, just a minute. Once we get back over F Street here and get past these little apartments up on the west side of us, we're going to see the back of the Mackey Mansion. Now, they've already started the daily tours up there, but if you don't want to take the tour, at least go by and see just how gorgeous that building is. It, of course, was never in any danger of that great fire. We also have some more mansions that made it through the fire way up on A Street. And of course, thankfully, we still have that Piper's on. But the Mackey Mansion up here was the absolute height of elegance and opulence. That is what you could have for only $140,000 back in the mid-1870s. Now, they've got a huge gazebo and a great big outdoor dance floor. And it's a real popular place for weddings and receptions. And quite often we get the wedding parties on the trains with us, and they're an awful lot of fun. But once we pass the Mackey Mansion, that means this little trip is almost over. A couple of things we need you to keep in mind. Wherever you're traveling today, whatever your final destination is, please travel safely so you can come back and see us. Also, we want to thank you for doing whatever you may have done or may still be doing to keep us all safe and healthy. We don't ever want to repeat that last year again. And last but not least, when you get home, if you go on Facebook and you like us, we will really like you. Thanks for joining us, guys. Have a great rest of your trip.